Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, being offered literal immortality.
Oh, wow. Just right out of the gate.
Right. Like a life completely free of pain, zero debt, no aging, no death. And it's all on this pristine, perfectly climate-controlled paradise island.
Sounds pretty good. I mean, sign me up.
Exactly. But now imagine turning every single bit of that down, choosing instead to go back to a difficult, highly stressful, aging life.
Which just defies all human logic, you know?
Totally. Why would anyone do that? Well, today in this deep dive, we are answering that exact question by looking at the first 6 books of Homer's Odyssey.
And just to clarify, we aren't approaching this as some dusty, academic history lesson.
No, definitely not.
Right. Our goal is to act as your guides. We want to help you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-life application from this text.
Because we're focusing on these deeply interwoven, kind of parallel journeys of a father and a son, right? Ulysses, the lost hero, and Telemachus, the boy left behind.
Yeah, and that decision to reject paradise, it really gets to the very core of what makes this entire story so remarkably relevant today.
It's so psychological.
It is. We want to take the struggles of these characters, their paralysis, their trauma, and basically map them directly onto the psychology of the modern world.
But I guess it helps to understand the baseline reality these characters are operating in first. Like, what is the context here?
Right. So the Trojan War has been over for a whole decade.
10 years.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other Greek heroes, they've either made it back home or, well, they died trying. But Ulysses is simply gone, just missing.
And back on his home island of Ithaca, things are an absolute mess. His estate has been completely overrun by this mob of hostile, arrogant suitors.
Yeah, they're essentially squatting.
Right. Eating his livestock, drinking all his wine, and demanding that his wife, Penelope, marry one of them.
And right in the middle of this absolute chaos is Telemachus, Ulysses' son, who is just essentially paralyzed.
He really is. He's this young man trapped in a house that isn't even really his own anymore, waiting for a savior who, might actually be dead.
And the irony is that the savior, Ulysses, is trapped too. He's stuck on that literal paradise island we mentioned earlier.
So beneath all the monsters and the myths, this is fundamentally a story about feeling stuck. Deeply, profoundly stuck.
I mean, we've all been there, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's about the immense, agonizing effort required to get moving again. But what's fascinating is that Homer doesn't start with Ulysses fighting his way out of paradise.
No, he doesn't. He starts by zooming all the way out to the cosmos.
Right, to the Council of the Gods, where we get this surprisingly modern, almost philosophical debate about personal responsibility.
Which is such a crucial narrative choice. I mean, we find Jove or Zeus, depending on your translation, opening the entire epic with what basically amounts to a complaint about human nature.
He's just venting.
He really is. He's reflecting on this mortal named Aegisthus. So Aegisthus had an affair with Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, and then murdered Agamemnon when he got back from the war.
And Jove is just incredibly frustrated by this.
Because the gods literally sent Mercury to warn Aegisthus not to do it. They explicitly told him, this will end in your own destruction.
But he did it anyway.
Right. He ignored the warning, committed the crime, and then was subsequently killed by Agamemnon's son. So Jove looks at this and says, "See now, how men lay blame upon us gods for what is, after all, nothing but their own folly."
I mean, that is just a staggering opening statement for a 3,000-year-old poem.
It really flips the script on how we view ancient religion.
Exactly. Because the ancient Greeks lived in a world where fate and the whims of the gods were viewed as these very real oppressive forces.
Yeah, you didn't cross the gods.
Right. Yet the highest authority in their pantheon opens the story by basically saying, stop blaming the universe for the messes you create through your own willful blindness.
It establishes personal agency as the central theme of the entire work. Humans are not just, playthings of fate.
Our choices actually matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when we ignore the warning signs, the fallout is our own doing. It acts as a 21st century wake-up call against the comfort of victimhood.
The comfort of victimhood. That's a great way to phrase it.
Well, there's a psychological safety there, right? If you believe that everything happening to you is the fault of the universe or the economy or other people,
then you don't have to change your behavior.
Precisely. If it's the god's fault, you're off the hook. But Jove is stripping away that comfort. He is pointing out the mechanism of self-sabotage.
Aegisthus had all the data. He got a direct, literal warning from a divine messenger.
But his desire and hubris just completely overrode logic. And I mean, we see this constantly today in business, in relationships.
Oh, totally. People see the red flags, they get the warnings from their friends or mentors, they proceed anyway. And then when the inevitable collapse happens, they just curse their bad luck.
Right. They say, why is this happening to me?
But I do have to push back a little bit on Joe's framing here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's look at the actual plot of the story. Neptune or Poseidon is literally actively tormenting Ulysses.
That is very true.
He is deliberately causing hurricanes and shipwrecks to keep Ulysses from getting home, all because Ulysses blinded his son, the Cyclops.
Yep, the ultimate grudge.
Right. So Joe's complaint feels a bit, I don't know, hypocritical. How can he say humans are entirely to blame for their suffering when a literal sea god is actively ruining a man's life?
That tension you're pointing out is actually one of the most sophisticated elements of the text, because it perfectly highlights the duality of the human condition.
How so?
Well, Neptune represents a very real, external, uncontrollable force. He embodies the storms of life.
Like sudden macroeconomic shifts.
Exactly, or unexpected health crises, or just unfair tragedies that hit us out of nowhere. We have absolutely no control over Neptune.
Right. The storm is going to happen regardless.
But Aegisthus represents the self-inflicted wounds. The wisdom here is discerning the difference between what the world is doing to you and what you are doing to yourself.
Ah, I see. So we suffer from external storms, but we compound our suffering immensely by making terrible, avoidable choices.
And then we have the audacity to blame the storm for the whole mess.
That makes so much sense. So Ulysses suffers because of Neptune, but his son, Telemachus, is suffering initially because of his own passivity.
Yes. Telemachus is the ultimate picture of a self-inflicted wound disguised as helplessness.
So let's examine the mechanics of that passivity, because when Minerva comes down to Ithaca, she's disguised as an old family friend named Mentis, right?
Right, she goes undercover.
And she finds Telemachus just sitting moodily among the suitors. He's daydreaming that his father will just burst through the doors, scatter the mob, and magically fix everything.
He is physically present in his own home, but psychologically, he is completely checked out.
It feels like he is living in his own life like a passive guest in an Airbnb.
That's exactly it.
And he's watching a bunch of terrible roommates completely trash the place. I mean, he's the host, but he's acting like a hostage.
He watches them consume his inheritance and feels entirely powerless to stop it because he is a hostage to his own lack of identity.
What do you mean by that?
Psychologically, Telemachus is suffering from this massive, ancient case of imposter syndrome.
Oh, that makes sense, given who his dad is.
Exactly. He even tells Minerva, "My mother tells me I am son to Ulysses, but it is a wise child that knows his own father."
Wow, that's heavy.
He feels the crushing weight of his father's legendary reputation. Ulysses is a mythic figure, this hero of the Trojan War, known for his unmatched intellect and cunning.
And Telemachus is just a kid. Young man who has never been tested.
Right. He feels entirely inadequate to fill those shoes, so his default response is just paralysis.
And the ambiguity of his situation is what makes it so incredibly relatable today. He tells Minerva that he inherits nothing but dismay.
Because if his father had died a glorious death at Troy, at least he'd have closure.
Exactly. He would have a grave to visit, a legacy to clearly inherit. But instead, he has this agonizing uncertainty.
The ambiguity is acting like a paralyzing agent.
Right. It's the same way people freeze up when they're waiting to hear back about a job offer or, waiting for a medical test result.
Yes, that liminal space between knowing and not knowing is where agency just goes to die.
But while Telemachus is frozen by that ambiguity, his mother, Penelope, is dealing with the exact same ambiguity but utilizing a completely different strategy.
She is brilliant. Because the suitors are demanding she declare Ulysses dead and choose one of them to marry.
And she is trapped in this hyper-patriarchal structure where overt defiance could literally mean violence or total ruin for her.
So she employs the famous shroud trick.
Right. She tells the suitors she must finish weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes, before she can remarry.
And she weaves this massive garment all day in full view of everyone.
But then she secretly unpicks the stitches every single night by torchlight.
She keeps this up for 3 entire years.
3 years? I mean, where Telemachus represents the paralysis of waiting for a savior, Penelope represents finding covert agency when overt power is completely unavailable to you.
She knows she can't physically throw 108 armed men out of her house. She just doesn't have the leverage.
So she uses subversion. She uses patience and her intellect.
Unweaving the shroud is just a profound metaphor for manipulating time. She is literally undoing the progress of time every night to maintain her autonomy.
It is an absolute masterclass in operating within constraints. She takes the societal expectations placed upon her, weaving, fulfilling familial duty, acting the part of the dutiful widow, and turns them into a weapon of delay.
It's incredibly smart. However, covert strategies do have a shelf life.
Right, they eventually catch her.
Yeah, one of her maids betrays her, the suitors catch her in the act, and she is forced to finish the shroud.
So the passivity in the house has reached an absolute breaking point. The crisis is imminent.
And this is exactly the moment Minerva's intervention with Telemachus becomes the catalyst for the entire epic.
And notice how Minerva operates here. She doesn't just wave a magic wand.
No, she doesn't do the work for him.
She doesn't strike the suitors with lightning or teleport Ulysses back into the living room. Instead, she gives Telemachus a roadmap to action.
She tells him to call an assembly of the town, speak his mind publicly, and then get on a ship to seek news of his father.
She provides the architecture for what we can call the Telemachus step.
The Telemachus step, I love that.
Yeah, because when you are deeply stuck, overwhelmed by a situation you feel you can't control, the natural human instinct is to wait until you feel confident before you make a move.
Right, we wait for inspiration to strike, we wait for courage.
But the mechanism of human psychology actually works in the reverse. Confidence is the result of action, not the prerequisite.
That is so true. The Telemachus step is the practice of taking one small, definitive physical action to break the cognitive loop of passivity.
So the action itself alters your brain state. For Telemachus, it meant calling the public assembly of Ithaca, which is the first one held since his father left 20 years ago.
It's a huge deal. It meant standing up in front of the town elders, holding the speaker's staff, and publicly stating his grievance.
And he doesn't do it perfectly either.
No, he actually bursts into tears out of sheer frustration and throws the staff on the ground.
But the perfection of the action doesn't matter. The execution of the action is what shatters the paralysis.
And that emotional outburst just highlights how difficult the Telemachus step truly is. Breaking inertia physically hurts.
Because he faces immediate mockery from the lead suitors, Antinous and Eurymachus.
They try to gaslight him, basically blaming Penelope for the whole situation.
But Telemachus doesn't retreat back into his daydreams this time. He pushes through the friction.
He packs a bag.
He swears his old nurse, Euryclea, to an oath of silence so she won't worry his mother, and he gets on a boat in the middle of the night.
He officially crosses the threshold. He didn't have to fight all 108 suitors to reclaim his agency. He just had to step off the island.
But having taken that step, he enters the unknown. An action without direction is just motion.
Fleeing a bad situation isn't necessarily the same as moving toward a good one.
Exactly. He needs wisdom. He needs to know what it looks like to be a man, a leader, a survivor. So he seeks out the elders who survived the war, sailing first to Nestor and Pylos and then to Menelaus and Helen in Sparta.
And as he leaves Ithaca, the narrative world expands, and it really requires us to apply some historical discernment here.
Yeah, we have to talk about the culture shock.
Because Homer presents a society built on ancient assumptions that can be pretty jarring for modern readers.
Like what?
Well, for instance, just the sheer scale of the religious and social rituals. When Telemachus arrives in Pylos, Nestor is on the beach sacrificing 81 black bulls to Neptune.
81. The sheer logistical effort and economic cost of that act is just staggering.
And then we encounter the strict, almost sacred rules of ancient hospitality, which they called xenia.
The concept of xenia is wild to think about today, because when Telemachus and his companion arrive at the glittering palace of Sparta, Menelaus' servant actually asks if they should invite the strangers in or send them away.
And Menelaus gets absolutely furious at the mere suggestion of turning them away.
He insists they bring the strangers in, bathe them, anoint them with oil, give them the absolute best cuts of meat.
And only after they have eaten and drank their fill do they even ask who they are or where they came from?
It is a completely different paradigm of trust and societal duty.
Well, you have to remember, in a violent, unpredictable, ancient world without formal infrastructure, xenia is basically the only safety net.
Right. You treated a stranger like royalty because tomorrow you might be the stranger washing up on a foreign shore.
But, and this is important, we must also acknowledge the brutal inequalities of this world. Menelaus and Helen live in unimaginably wealthy surroundings.
Gold, silver, amber, ivory, everywhere.
And Menelaus casually mentions accumulating this wealth over 7 years of wandering, which heavily implies, piracy and conquest.
And this luxury is, of course, maintained by enslaved people.
Exactly. We have to hold these truths simultaneously. The text contains profound psychological wisdom, but it was forged in a deeply flawed, unequal, and often brutal social system.
It's crucial to keep that discernment intact as we do this deep dive. Because while the socioeconomic setting is ancient, the psychological coping mechanisms they display are just painfully modern.
Oh, without a doubt. Let's look at what actually happens in Sparta.
So Telemachus is sitting with Menelaus and Helen, and they start talking about the Trojan War, the heavy toll it took, the friends who died, and the fact that Ulysses is still missing.
And the grief in the room just becomes overwhelming. Everyone starts weeping. Telemachus is hiding his face, crying into his cloak.
And then Helen does something incredibly calculating. She literally drugs the wine.
Yeah, Homer describes it as an Egyptian herb cast into the mixing bowl that banishes all care, sorrow, and ill humor.
Which is terrifyingly specific.
The text states it is so powerful that if you drink it, you won't shed a tear even if your parents drop dead or your brother is hacked to pieces right in front of you.
It is an absolute emotional anesthetic. But wait, if Helen is drugging the wine to stop the crying over trauma, isn't that just a 3,000-year-old version of doom scrolling? Or binge drinking?
That's exactly what it is. It's a mechanism designed to artificially erase the emotional toll of reality.
Menelaus, Helen, and their court are living in unparalleled luxury, but they are haunted by PTSD, by the ghosts of Troy, by guilt and deep grief.
And the pain of sitting with that reality becomes just too much, so she introduces a substance to build a wall between themselves and their discomfort.
It is a profound metaphor for modern numbing. We might not have a magical Egyptian herb, but our society is built on functional equivalents.
We utilize social media feeds specifically engineered by algorithms to hijack our attention and scroll away our anxiety.
We use substances, compulsive working, endless content consumption.
Or even toxic positivity, the insistence that everything is fine, just to avoid the grueling work of processing pain.
Helen's drug represents the human desire to skip the healing process and go straight to the absence of pain.
But the danger of Helen's drug is that while it stops the crying, it also completely paralyzes the processing.
You can't heal a psychological wound by taking a painkiller and pretending it isn't there. You have to clean it, examine it, and figure out how to live with the scar.
Because numbing prevents growth.
So if you are listening to this right now, consider, what is the Helen's drug you are using in your own life?
What are you consuming, doing, or buying to avoid sitting in the quiet with an uncomfortable reality about your career, your marriage, or your own internal state?
To find true clarity, you have to do the exact opposite of numbing. You have to wrestle with the uncomfortable reality.
And Homer provides an incredible visual metaphor for this wrestling match immediately after the drugging scene.
The tale of Proteus.
Yes. Menelaus recounts to Telemachus how, after the war, he was stuck on an island off the coast of Egypt. His ships were becalmed, his men were starving.
And a minor goddess tells him the only way out is to capture her father, Proteus, the old man of the sea, and basically force him to reveal the path home.
And capturing Proteus is an absolute nightmare.
Right. The goddess tells Menelaus he has to hide on the beach under the rotting, smelly skins of dead seals.
Which is just awful.
When Proteus comes out of the water at noon to sleep among his seals, Menelaus and 3 of his strongest men have to ambush him and just hold on for dear life.
And why? Because Proteus is a shapeshifter. Menelaus grabs him, and Proteus immediately turns into a heavily maned lion.
Then he shifts into a dragon.
Then a leopard, a wild boar. Then he turns into running water, and finally into a tall, leafy tree.
And Menelaus just has to grip him tighter and tighter through all of these terrifying transformations until Proteus finally exhausts himself, returns to his true form, and gives him the straight answer.
The mechanism of this myth perfectly maps onto the elusive nature of truth. Proteus represents the resistance we face whenever we try to uncover a deep reality.
Whether it's diagnosing a failing business strategy, confronting a toxic dynamic in a relationship, or just facing our own internal flaws.
The truth actively resists being known. It shapeshifts.
I mean, think about confronting a partner about a recurring issue. First, the truth turns into a lion. They get angry and defensive, roaring to scare you off.
Right, and if you hold on, the truth turns into water. They get slippery, changing the subject, evading the point, sliding through your arguments.
And if you still hold on, it turns into a tree-pure, stubborn, unyielding silence.
The psychological defense mechanisms of the human ego are entirely protean.
The creative process and analytical problem-solving work the exact same way, too.
Oh, absolutely. When you are trying to extract a clear narrative from a massive, complex data set, at first it just looks like chaos.
It looks like a dragon trying to burn down your confidence.
And the instinct is to let go, to say, this is too hard, and just walk away.
But the only way to get the breakthrough is to endure the shape-shifting. You have to grip the problem tighter through the confusion and the fear.
Menelaus got his answer because he didn't let go when the truth got scary.
So the practical application here is setting the right expectation. When you are seeking direction, expect the resistance. When your goal starts looking like a terrifying bore or slipping away like water, you haven't failed. You're just in the middle of the wrestling match.
That is not the signal to let go. That is the signal that you are getting close to the core of the matter and you need to hold on.
And it is through this wrestling match with Proteus that Menelaus finally learns the whereabouts of the man everyone is looking for.
Proteus reveals that Ulysses is actually alive, but he is trapped on an island by a nymph named Calypso.
So, in Book 5, the narrative focus shifts entirely, and the camera pans to our missing hero. But we don't find him in a dungeon or chained to a rock.
We find him in a literal, overwhelming paradise.
The gods hold another council. Jove is finally spurred to action by Minerva, and he sends Mercury to Calypso's island to deliver an eviction notice.
And Homer's description of this island, Ogygia, is a masterclass in sensory overload.
Mercury arrives and immediately smells the fragrant reek of burning cedar and sandalwood.
Calypso is singing with a beautiful voice at her loom, throwing a golden shuttle.
There are thick, lush woods of alder and cypress, a vine loaded with heavy grapes, and 4 running rills of crystal-clear water flowing through soft beds of violets.
It is so stunningly perfect that even Mercury, an immortal god who lives on Olympus, just stands still in awe.
It is the ultimate anesthetic environment. But before we analyze Ulysses' reaction to this paradise, we must examine Calypso herself.
Yes, because when Mercury delivers the mandate that she must release Ulysses, she doesn't just bow her head in submission.
She launches into a fierce, brilliantly articulated, and entirely justified critique of the Olympian power structure.
She calls out the male gods for their blatant systemic hypocrisy.
She basically brings receipts. She cites precedent.
She does. She points out that male gods constantly descend to Earth, take mortal lovers, and face absolutely zero consequences.
But the moment a goddess takes a mortal man, a man she saved from drowning, no less, the male gods are furious, declare it a scandal, and demand she give him up.
She references Dawn and Orion, Ceres, and Iasian. She is basically saying, the rules of this universe are rigged to protect your power while punishing my autonomy.
Her rant is a totally valid feminist critique of a patriarchal double standard.
And this is a vital moment for, wisdom with discernment. Calypso is the antagonist of this section. She is the obstacle preventing the hero from reaching his goal.
But being the antagonist does not mean her systemic critique is wrong.
Her anger is completely justified. Modern readers might resist painting her purely as a villain, and they are right to do so.
She is a powerful figure operating in a fundamentally unfair system.
However, despite the validity of her grievances against the gods, the reality remains that her love has become a prison for Ulysses.
And this brings us back to Ulysses. Let's look at his situation objectively. His entire crew is dead because they foolishly ate the cattle of the sun god.
His ship was destroyed by lightning. He was literally drowning in the open ocean.
Calypso saved his life. She cherishes him. She provides for his every need. And most importantly, she is offering him literal immortality.
He never has to age. He never has to die.
He never has to worry about war or famine or loss ever again. And yet, where is he?
He's not lounging in the violets?
No. He sits on the rocky shore every single day, weeping, groaning, and staring out at the barren gray ocean.
He is actively grieving because he wants to go back to an aging wife and a rocky, unglamorous island.
The central philosophical question of his character is contained in those tears on the beach. Why choose suffering, aging, and death over eternal, painless paradise?
Because for Ulysses, Calypso's island represents the ultimate golden handcuffs.
In the modern corporate world, golden handcuffs refer to a job that pays you so much money or offers such incredible perks that you feel you just cannot leave, even if the work is crushing your soul and completely disconnected from your true purpose.
Calypso's island is a life that looks like an absolute dream on paper, but feels like an existential prison to your soul.
Immortality, in this context, is the temptation to avoid the messy, painful, but deeply meaningful human experience.
Calypso is offering him an eternal plateau.
But Ulysses realizes that a life without risk, without the vulnerability of aging, without the struggle to build something, protect it, and eventually pass it on, is a life devoid of meaning.
Pain and mortality are the very things that give human connection its value.
He chooses Penelope, who will age and eventually die, over Calypso, who will be eternally perfect, because his bond with Penelope is forged in the shared vulnerability of the human condition.
He is choosing the arena of real life over the spectator seats of paradise.
So the reflection for you, the listener, is to examine where in your life you might be wearing golden handcuffs.
Are you in a comfortable relationship that demands no growth but offers no deep, vulnerable connection?
Are you in a career that pays the bills luxuriously, but leaves you feeling hollow at the end of the day?
The profound wisdom of Ulysses is recognizing that comfort is not a substitute for purpose. Sometimes, to reclaim your own narrative and find your actual life, you have to voluntarily walk away from paradise.
But making the choice to walk away from those golden handcuffs is only half the battle. Once you step out of the illusion of safety, reality tends to hit you with a hurricane.
Literally, in this case. And that's exactly what happens. Calypso, true to her word, tells Ulysses he can leave, but he has to build his own raft.
She gives him a bronze axe and an adze, and he goes to work.
In 4 days, he chops down 20 massive trees, adzes them smooth, fits them together with pegs, builds a deck, a mast, and a sail.
It's an incredible display of sheer competence and restored agency. He isn't waiting to be rescued anymore. He is building his own way out of the trap.
He engineers a very sturdy, reliable craft, and he sets sail.
For 18 days, he navigates purely by the stars, keeping the constellation of the Bear to his left, exactly as Calypso instructed. He does everything right.
He puts in the hard work, he applies his intelligence, and he is so close to safety that he can actually see the shadowy mountains of the Phaeacian coast on the horizon.
But taking agency and doing the right thing does not guarantee smooth sailing.
No, in fact, taking a risk often invites immediate, violent pushback from the universe.
Right at that moment, Neptune returns from a trip to the Ethiopians, spots Ulysses on the water, and unleashes absolute cosmic fury.
The storm is catastrophic. Neptune gathers the clouds, churns the sea with his trident, and blasts Ulysses with winds from the east, south, north, and west simultaneously.
The mast snaps under the pressure. The sail goes overboard. Ulysses is dragged deep underwater, and the heavy divine clothes Calypso gave him actually weigh him down, almost drowning him.
He barely manages to fight his way back to the surface and swims to the shattered pieces of his raft, holding on for dear life as the wind spins it like thistle down in a tornado.
And this is where the narrative introduces a wildly counterintuitive survival mechanism. A sea goddess named Ino, also known as Leucothea, rises from the waves like a seagull and lands on his broken raft.
Ino sees his desperate situation and takes pity on him. She assures him that while Neptune will bluster and torment him, he will not actually kill him.
But her instructions for survival defy all logic. She tells Ulysses to strip off the heavy clothes, completely abandon the raft, and swim for the unknown shore.
To protect him, she offers him her magic veil, telling him to tie it tightly around his chest. Once he reaches land, he must throw the veil back into the sea without looking behind him.
Now, put yourself in Ulysses' mindset here. Your raft might be broken, the mast might be gone, but it is made of solid, buoyant wood.
It is the only tangible thing between you and a mile of deep, churning ocean.
And a strange goddess lands on it and tells you to let go of the wood and trust a magic scarf.
I mean, I completely understand why Ulysses is deeply suspicious. He basically says, absolutely not. I know how the gods operate. This is a trick to get me to drown faster. I'm staying on this wood as long as the pegs hold it together.
His suspicion is a completely rational trauma response. Think about the mechanism of trust.
When you have been relentlessly battered by life, when your ships have been struck by lightning, your friends have been eaten by monsters, and your journey has been cursed by the god of the sea, you develop profound trust issues.
You assume every offer of help is a trap. Ulysses is relying on his own engineering, his own effort, his own raft, because it is the only thing in the universe he believes he can control.
He trusts the wood because he cut the wood himself.
But the ocean doesn't care about his engineering. A massive wave comes crashing down and smashes the raft into literal chaff. The wood is entirely gone.
Ulysses is left treading water, and he is forced to do exactly what Aina advised.
He strips off the heavy clothes, ties the veil around his chest, and plunges into the terrifying open water.
This sequence introduces a vital practice in emotional and psychological resilience, which is the practice of relinquishing the raft.
Relinquishing the raft, because Ulysses spent days meticulously building that raft. It was his brainchild, his vehicle for salvation. So of course he didn't want to let it go.
We see this dynamic constantly in human behavior. It is the sunk cost fallacy magnified by existential dread.
How often do we cling to the strategies, the business models, the relationships, or the identities we painstakingly built, even when they are actively sinking beneath us?
We hold on to the broken pieces of our past efforts because we are terrified of the vulnerability of swimming in the open water.
A failing business might be stressful, but at least it's a stress you know. Quitting and starting over is the terrifying unknown.
A toxic relationship might be painful, but the prospect of being alone in the dating pool feels like drowning.
The wisdom here is knowing when your raft has served its purpose and has transitioned into a liability. Sometimes survival requires actively abandoning the very thing you built and accepting a new, terrifying lifeline.
And relinquishing the raft doesn't mean the ordeal is suddenly over. Ulysses swims for 2 days and 2 nights in a massive swell.
When he finally gets close to the coast, it isn't a soft, welcoming sandy beach. It's a nightmare of jagged, sheer rock cliffs with a pounding, violent surf.
He gets caught by a massive wave smashed against the rocks, and he clings to the cliff face with his bare hands while the wave recedes.
The force of the water literally tears the skin off his fingers. He gets sucked back out to sea, almost drowns again, and finally realizes he has to swim laterally along the coast until he finds the mouth of a river where the water is calm enough to crawl ashore.
The image of Ulysses clinging to those jagged rocks with torn hands is the perfect analogy for the excruciating transition periods in life.
Have you ever been caught in that space? The space between the raging sea of your past and the hard, unyielding reality of your future.
You left the bad job or you finally ended the toxic relationship, but you haven't found the new shore yet.
You haven't found the new job or the new community. You are just being battered against the rocks of a transition.
The sheer brutal endurance required to survive those liminal moments where you are just holding your breath until the wave recedes, assessing the situation, and finding the strength to swim further down the coast to find a safe harbor is staggering.
It requires profound flexibility. If Ulysses had stubbornly tried to force a landing on the rocks because he was tired, he would have been crushed.
He had to yield to the reality of the environment, swim back out into the terrifying ocean, and find a better way.
And having survived this ultimate wilderness of the sea, he crawls ashore, collapses in the reeds, throws the veil back to Aina, and buries himself under a thicket of olive bushes just to keep from freezing to death.
He is stripped of everything. His ships, his men, his raft, his clothes, even the skin on his hands. He is reduced to bare, shivering humanity.
But the journey isn't over. Survival in the wild is one thing. Navigating human society is another.
Which brings us to the fascinating challenge of re-entry. Ulysses is asleep, naked, crusted in salt, hiding under a bush.
Meanwhile, Minerva goes into the nearby city of the Phaeacians and visits the young princess Nausicaa in a dream.
She tells Nausicaa to go do laundry at the river the next morning to prepare for her eventual marriage.
So Nausicaa and her maids take a wagon to the river, wash the clothes, and while waiting for them to dry, they start playing a game of catch.
The ball goes rogue, splashes into the deep water, the girls scream, and the noise wakes up Ulysses.
The contrast here is brilliant. Survival in the ocean required brute strength, physical endurance, and a primal refusal to die.
But reintegration into society, asking for help from a position of profound vulnerability, requires a completely different skill set.
It requires empathy, tact, and the ability to read the room. Because when Ulysses crawls out from under the olive thicket, he is a terrifying sight.
Homer compares him to a starving, feral mountain lion with fire in his eyes. He is naked, holding a leafy branch over himself, and desperate.
The maids take one look at this wild man and scatter in an absolute panic.
Only Nausicaa stands her ground, and the text notes that Minerva puts courage in her heart.
Now, Ulysses is faced with a split-second tactical decision. The traditional, expected Greek move for a suppliant, someone begging for their life or for help, is to run up, fall to your knees, and physically clasp the knees of the person you are begging.
It's an aggressive, highly physical plea.
But Ulysses calculates the reality of the situation. He realizes that if a naked, wild-looking, salt-crusted man runs at an isolated teenage princess and grabs her legs, she's going to be terrified.
It would trigger a fight-or-flight response, and he would lose his only chance at salvation.
He applies a mechanism we can call the Ulysses tact.
Instead of rushing her, he stays back. He manages his own extreme desperation. He is starving, thirsty, and dying of exposure in order to prioritize her physical and psychological safety.
He maintains distance. And then he uses what Homer describes as honeyed and persuasive language.
He flatters her beautifully, asking if she's a goddess, comparing her grace to a young palm tree he once saw growing beside the altar of Apollo in Delos.
He acknowledges how proud her parents and her future husband must be. And crucially, he asks for the absolute minimum.
He doesn't ask for a royal escort or a massive feast. He just asks for a rag to wrap himself in and directions to the town.
It is a masterclass in emotional intelligence deployed from a deficit.
The modern equivalent is like walking into a high-stakes venture capital pitch meeting or a crucial job interview directly after surviving a literal car crash.
You are an absolute mess. Your clothes are torn, you're exhausted, you have zero status markers, you cannot rely on your appearance or your resume.
You have to win them over entirely with your situational awareness, your management of boundaries, and your profound emotional intelligence.
You have to make the person across from you feel safe, respected, and empowered before you ask them for a single thing.
It perfectly illustrates the reality of networking or seeking help when you are at rock bottom. When you need help the most, you are often at your least presentable.
The Ulysses tact is the understanding that your desperation does not negate the other person's boundaries.
His success here isn't based on his physical strength, it's based on his radical empathy.
And because he manages the interaction so skillfully, Nausicaa responds with equal intelligence. She doesn't just throw him a rag.
She calls back her maids, provides him with a bath, olive oil, fine clothes, and food.
And she is incredibly shrewd about the local politics. She gives him highly specific instructions on how to enter the town without causing a scandal.
She tells him they cannot walk into the city together because the locals are gossips.
They will see a handsome stranger with the princess and start rumors that she found a foreign husband and is snubbing the local nobleman.
She protects her own reputation while saving his life.
And she tells him to bypass her father, the king, and appeal directly to her mother, Queen Arete, who holds the real social power and influence in the court.
It's an amazing interaction between two highly intelligent people negotiating a very delicate, high-stakes social dynamic.
It beautifully sets the stage for the next phase of his journey. But as we reflect on this incredible arc, from Telemachus breaking his paralysis, to Ulysses rejecting paradise, surviving the storm, and tactfully re-entering society, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought about the nature of the divine in this text.
Throughout these chapters, we see the gods intervening constantly. Jove, Minerva, Neptune, Ino.
But pay close attention to how Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, actually operates. She rarely acts as a magic wand.
Building on that, when she helps Telemachus, she doesn't fight the suitors for him. She gives him a strategic plan and the push to execute it.
When she helps Nausicaa stand firm against the terrifying sight of Ulysses, the text explicitly says she put courage in her heart.
When Ulysses is being smashed against the rocks, she doesn't teleport him to the beach. She gives him the presence of mind to grab the rock and hold on.
She enhances the human capacity that is already there.
The question this raises for us today is profound. What if we view the gods in our own lives not as external saviors coming to rescue us, but as our own deepest intuition and highest courage finally speaking up?
When you find the sudden, inexplicable bravery to take the Telemach step and change your life, or when you find the strategic presence of mind to use the Ulysses tact when you are desperate, is that an external force? Or is it the divine spark of resilience within your own human spirit waking up to meet the moment?
The ancient world saw gods pulling the strings. Perhaps we can look at the same stories and see the vast untapped potential of our own wisdom and endurance.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.